And about 32% of the state budget in 2010 comes from those fees. Now, this is what the state budget, if you just look at dollars collected or spent in state budget, looks like over time. So you can see that there's a growth of about, I'm going to go through several slides that have very similar format. Along the bottom it's going to say 4.7%. That's the annual growth in dollars coming into the state of Colorado for our total state budget. And this is a period, as you will notice, from 2001 to 2011. Now, if you adjust those dollars for inflation, i.e. the purchasing power of those dollars, you see the growth rate changes a little bit. It goes from 4.7% annually to 2.6% annually. Everybody with me? Now let's adjust it for the other component in the Tabor Amendment, and also a really important driver when we start thinking about providing public services, and that's the number of people in this state. So if you adjust it for population, growth levels off again. Our annual average growth rate is about 0.9% each year from the decade from 2001 to 2011. Let's peel away another layer, because we're really talking about what's going on here in Colorado, right? So if we take away the Federal Recovery Acts, we just talked about that, the Federal Recovery Act money, take away the stimulus money, continue to adjust state general fund or the state budget for inflation and population, you see that the state budget has grown about 0.6%. That's less than 1% a year annually from the period 2001 to 2011. Let's keep peeling away the layers of the onion. Let's take away all the federal funds. Let's strip it out. So all we're now looking at are the dollars that we as folks here in the state of Colorado contribute to the effort. You'll see that we now are at 0.17% growth over time. Now, I just want to do something here. I'm going to show you some things. You can disagree with whether you think this is the right approach or not, but I'm up here, and so I get to do it, and you can ignore it. Because we're talking about what we pay and what we contribute as Coloradans, I've taken out out-of-state tuition, because, you know, that's the way we've been relying on funding much of our higher education system over the last few years, is by getting people who come here because it's such a fabulous place. We charge them a lot of tuition to come to college here. It's been a long-term strategy of the state. So if you take out of that cash fund amount, because that's where tuition shows up in the little chart I showed you, take out what we pay or what is paid by others in out-of-state tuition, you can see the total growth in the general fund, or the total growth in the budget is about 0.24%. Oh, a little sensitive little guy, isn't he? I'm sorry, it's actually a negative 0.24%. And then if we take one other step and we just take out all fees for service altogether, so all we're looking at now is just the general, one more slide, just the general fund. That's just the income taxes and sales tax dollars adjusted for inflation and population. It's actually fallen per capita, that's what inflation plus population is, 1.2% over the last 10 years. The average reduction per year is 1.2%. Now, from that you might say, well, that's the problem. And the lady in the front row said, well, the problem is it's all about fees. Well, let's talk about fees for just a little bit so that we all know, have a good sense of what's going on here. If we just talk about cash funds alone, we see that they've grown about, fees have grown about 1.6% compounded annually over the decade. Now, there have been two fees that I want to take out because the general taxpayer doesn't pay them. One is tuition, so now I'm going to take out all the tuition. We're also going to take out something called the hospital provider fee, which is something that hospitals pay in so that we have dollars to match up federal Medicaid dollars so that we get more federal money back. Let's take that out because none of us pay for that, and most hospitals provide this fee and then get more money back, so it's not really a cost. Let's take that out. The hospitals do, but they don't. No, I'm not going to engage you in that conversation right now, but I will later, I promise. They don't charge the patient, actually, in this case. And so what we end up here is that even our fees, even with the thing that so many people are so concerned about, Our transportation fees have increased on average annually 0.09% over the last decade. Most of this data, actually all of this data, came from the Joint Budget Committee, which is the committee at the legislature that adopts the budget. We just arrayed it in a variety of different ways. So let's talk about present spending. We're coming out of the worst recession we've had in 40 years, maybe ever, and we've had some serious reductions in spending over the last few years. Let's talk about K-12 education for just a minute. We've had $500 million in cumulative cuts over the last 3 years, while at the same time we've been providing educational opportunities for an additional 20,000 full-time students. The 2011-12 proposal takes an additional $836 million. It's below $836 million below fully funding our School Finance Act. That's the law that we say that we want to fund. That's the way the legislature says legally we're supposed to fund our schools. The amount in the 2011-12 proposal will be per pupil spending of $1,001 per student less than Amendment 23 intended. Amendment 23 was a provision that we as voters adopted as part of our Constitution in 2000, but will be just about $1,000 below those Amendment 23 levels with the 2012 budget. The 2012 budget will result in a $497 per student less than last year, or the year that we're currently in. And based upon the current 2012 proposal, we propose to spend, the state proposed to spend less next year than the first year of Amendment 23 when adjusted for inflation. Now the next two charts are just explaining in a different sort of way the things I've already explained. I'm looking at hard copies here and they're not color, so I have to turn around and look there, so excuse me for turning around. But what this shows is these are total dollars spent. The gray part is dollars that we're not spending. We're only going to be spending the proposal in 2011, but is the green part. You can see sort of what I graphically demonstrated, or what I said graphically demonstrated here, $836 million below fully funding the school finance formula next year. This slide, make sure I've got, it's hard with that thing up there. This is the slide that demonstrates, again, in the green bars, the gray bars, where the gray bars are funding where we should be if we were fully funding Amendment 23. The green bars is where the actual spending will be, which shows that we'll be $1,000 less than what Amendment 23 suggested, or where we should be if we were fully complying with Amendment 23. This chart is interesting. It's prepared by, it is not a chart I prepared. It is a chart prepared by Great Education Colorado, a partner organization of ours in a lot of this activity. And it shows where Colorado ranks in spending per pupil as compared to other states in the country. The line across the zero line is the national average. If you look at this chart, it says back in the 80s, we were significantly above, or at least above the national average in spending per pupil. Starting around the mid-80s, we started to drop below the national average here in Colorado. In 1992, when Tabor passed, we were just about, looks like about $400 below the national average in spending per pupil. In 2000, when Amendment 23 was voted in to the Constitution by all of us as voters, we were $696 below the national average in per pupil funding. In 2007, we had fallen to $1,397 below the national average in spending per pupil. And in 2007, we were close to $1,700 below the national average in spending per pupil. Now, I'm not saying that spending per pupil is the only measure or even the best measure. It is a measure. And it is a measure that we think about all of the time because it is a comparison and it is one of those things that people look at when they think about the commitment that we make to our schools. Let's talk about K-12 or higher education for just a minute. Higher education, unlike K-12 education, doesn't have a constitutional protection. The fiscal year 2011 proposal, the state will invest less in 2011-12 than was invested in 98, not including inflation, not adjusted for inflation. It's an $878 per pupil decline from last year. Now, one of the reasons these cuts are so big is that ARA money that we talked about, that American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, stimulus dollars, cushioned a lot of these cuts. And some people would argue they shouldn't have, that we should have made these cuts 3 years ago. And you can decide that that's what we should have done or shouldn't have done, but it's not what we did. And we use that money to avoid these kinds of cut in our spending on higher education. But now we're having to make them because we don't have any choices, as we have to balance the budget. And we know that federal stimulus dollars ended last year. This is another one of these charts that demonstrates what I was talking about. If you look again at the green bar, that's the amount of money we actually spent per year. You can see in the 9, 10, and 11, we saw some funding that filled in. That's the light blue chart. The light blue part of the bars, that was the federal stimulus money. And the line that runs across the top up there, that's the number of students. So we have more and more students in the system all the time, and we're spending less money, state money. Where does that money get made up? Tuition. We've seen very dramatic increases in tuition, which means that parents and students, families and students, are picking up a larger and larger share of funding of higher education. Again, you may think that's exactly the right thing to do. I'm not going to argue one way or another, but I think we just need to understand that as state general fund for supporting schools goes down, the support comes from families. And I think this chart does a pretty good job of showing exactly how we've been funding K-12 education in the state of Colorado. The blue thing at the bottom, I don't know, line, lump, I don't know what you want to call it, is the general fund dollars that have been spent on K-12 education. The pink is resident tuition. Remember I talked about non-resident and resident? That's the pink is resident tuition. Look how much bigger the bar is at the far end in 2011 than it was down here in 2001. And you see our non-resident tuition percentage has remained relatively constant. We've made up for it by increasing resident tuition over time. The third major piece of the spending I want to talk about is health care. Public dollars for health care are primarily spent through the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program provides health care for low-income Coloradans. It's a match between state and local government. We know that in America, the primary way for getting health insurance is through your employer. In times of high unemployment, we have fewer and fewer folks who get health insurance through their employer because we have fewer and fewer people working. As a result, demand for Medicaid goes up. Enrollment in Medicaid in the state of Colorado has increased 100% over the last 3 years. Now, a lot of that cost has been borne by an enhanced match or an enhanced contribution for the federal government from the Stimulus Act again, right? We keep talking about that. And what it did normally in the state of Colorado, for every dollar that the state puts in, the federal government puts in about $1 to provide Medicaid coverage. During the recession, and with the sense that there was going to be a whole lot more people that were going to be needing the services, the federal government is now putting in about a little over 60 cents. I think it's 66 cents. And the state government contributes 33 cents for every dollar spent. Okay? We know enrollment, there's 3 big pressures on Medicaid. Enrollments are increasing, costs are increasing, and you know what? Each and every one of us is getting older. Well, I used to say when I did this presentation, everybody's aging but those of us in this room. But in reality, we're all getting older too. This shows the growth in the Medicaid caseload that I talked about. We've had a 100% increase in enrollment since, I'm sorry, I said 3 years, it's since 2001. Children's Basic Health Plan enrollment has increased 179% during the same period. Medical costs are also going up. And in fact, medical costs are going up much faster than the rate of inflation at about 40% as compared to about 17% for inflation during the period of 01 to 12. And here's the statistic that I think we all gasp at, and I do because I'm